you are a lawyer,
Yes.
a biker,
Yes.
a father,
Yes.
a husband,
Yes.
and my favorite, a nunchuck-wielding beacon of justice.
That is a quote from a client.
Welcome, everybody, to this edition, special edition of Our Nevada Judges.
So I'm special.
You are special.
Wait, what kind of
And
special?
I'm going to tell you why you're special,
Wait,
right?
what kind of special are we
I'm
talking
gonna
about here?
Yeah,
John?
not that kind. Not as far as education goes.
Okay, all right. My mom says I'm special. So.
All our moms think we're special,
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
So, our guest today is Stephen Stubbs. Stephen is, according to your website,
Okay.
which I love the bow tie justice.
Okay.
That's awesome.
Bowtiejustice.com.
But according to your website, you are, and not necessarily in this order, but you are a lawyer,
Yes.
a biker,
Yes.
a father,
Yes.
a husband,
Yes.
and my favorite, a nunchuck-wielding beacon of justice.
That is a quote from a client.
That's awesome. I love that.
Nunchuck wielding beacon of justice.
That's
a
awesome.
client told me that once, and I stole it. So.
So the first question that I have to ask that's obvious, do you really know how to use nunchucks?
Oh yeah, I nunchuck dance. I've got videos.
All right, cool.
Yeah, there
okay,
we go.
then we can get started.
All right. There we go.
And I believe that we're going to talk today about whether or not I have the right to tell a police officer I'm not doing that, or no,
yes.
or whatever.
A request versus a demand is the
Right.
focus.
Okay.
Right? The focus.
And so how do I know the difference between a request or a demand from a police officer? Because in my generation, we were taught to have respect for law enforcement, regardless of what you see on TV. But if they ask you to do something, you do it. And that's not necessarily a good thing for you at times.
Well, can we first talk about respect?
Yes, please.
Because one of the biggest mistakes that anybody makes, especially a police accountability activist, right? They call themselves auditors sometimes, to where they go out and they see if police, they usually videotape, and they see if police are doing the right thing. One of the biggest mistakes they make that makes it almost impossible to file a lawsuit is they are not respectful. Even if you're right, even if the police violate your rights, your civil rights, and you are 100% correct, if a jury is not going to like you because you're acting a fool, then an attorney is not going to want to take your case. It would have to be an extreme case for an attorney to even look at it, because the judge can say in a motion for summary judgment, you are correct. Even a jury can say, yep, you are correct. But then the jury has a second question. How much is this worth? And if you're acting a fool, they're not going to want to give you money. They could give you $1, right? And an attorney isn't going to want to take that risk with their time and years it takes, the amount of money they have to put up and spend as expenses, all these types of things, if they're not going to get paid back, at least for their expenses. Even if they're fighting for justice, they want their expenses back. And so you really have to be respectful. And this actually goes both ways too, because as a police officer, if you're not respectful, it goes the opposite way too. A jury is going to want to give a lot more money, and it could put your job on the line.
Right.
And so respect is always important. You can stand your ground and you can respectfully assert positions and make sure that your rights are not violated. And then later on, you can certainly go to court. And that's also why it's important to videotape. So
I have to ask this question because it popped into my head when you were talking about the advocates or the auditors.
yes.
It sounds to me like it's almost entrapment in reverse. In other words, they're going out to try to see if they can provoke an officer into doing something wrong. Am I misreading that, or?
Some of them do.
Okay.
Some of them don't.
Okay.
I have a client, Kelly Patterson.
Okay.
We'll talk about his case here
Great.
towards the end. He does everything right, and he doesn't try to provoke anybody. Some people do go out and provoke. And that's actually legal. And the best thing a police officer can do is just ignore them, right? Because there comes a point where you realize, oh, this person is just trying to cause me grief, right? And so, but you have every right to act legally, right? Even in ways that might bring up some suspicion, because that's what they do.
Right.
They do something. They auditors try to provoke. It's a game of them trying to do something suspicious without actually breaking the law, and they try to that probable cause, reasonable suspicion. They try to dance that line a little bit, right? And some of them do it very well and get some lawsuits against police officers, and others don't do it so hot, and they end up
on the wrong
arrested like too often, right? So yeah, they do that. I would never advocate for that. I do appreciate police accountability advocates that do it the right way. I appreciate them, and I gladly take their cases. But yeah, be respectful, right?
Well, I mean
it's important.
That goes without saying.
Well, I wish it went without saying.
I mean,
but it doesn't seem to.
Yeah.
Now let's go to the request versus
I was
demand.
just going to say let's get into that, because that's interesting as hell.
Okay. So you 100% have the right, the constitutional right, to ignore a request by a law enforcement officer, if it is in fact a request. There's 2 United States Supreme Court cases. Colander is one, and that's the main one. But there's 2 United States Supreme Court cases that says that you have the right to ignore a request from a law enforcement officer without fear of prosecution.
Okay.
Right? And that includes arrest,
right,
without fear of arrest. So that is well established for decades. Well-established binding authority for the entire United States, if it is a request. Now, if it is a demand or a command, we might use those terms like synonymously,
interchangeably,
right?
Yeah.
If it's a request, or if it's a demand or a command, you do not have the right to not comply, even if the officer is wrong, right? If he says you are being detained and he was wrong in detaining you, the very fact that he's making the command to stop, or making the demand to move to the front of my vehicle, or identify yourself, right? If it is a demand, you need to obey that demand. You can verbally challenge the demand, but you do need to eventually obey within a reasonable amount of time.
So if an officer, and let's take a traffic stop, if an officer pulls you over and comes up to the car and says, "May I see your identification?"
Okay, so
to me that's a request.
That is 100% a request.
Okay.
The easiest way to distinguish between a request and a demand is to ask the officer. Just ask him, right? Is that a request?
Just say, "I'm sorry, is that a request or a demand?"
Yes.
Really?
And sometimes the officers don't answer that question, but you have the right to verbally challenge a police officer and their actions. And asking a question like that is something that a court will uphold in your favor 100% of the time. Okay? If you politely ask, is that a request or a demand? You can even say, according to the United States Supreme Court case Colander, Kolandder, I have the right to ignore and refuse to obey a request. So this is important, right? I need to know whether this is a request or a demand. Now, but whatever the officer tells you at that time, you need to take it at face value. You can challenge it later in court,
right?
But whatever they say at that time, take it at face value. If they say stop, you stop. If they say, identify yourself, you have to state your legal name.
But
right?
but that sounds like a demand. If it's something like stop or identify yourself, as opposed to may I see this, or would you mind stepping out of your vehicle, or something like that.
You're right.
Is that I'm trying to clarify in my own head.
Absolutely, and communication needs to be better.
Okay.
On all sides.
All right.
But there are times when an officer does not have the right to command or demand anything. They have to have reasonable suspicion,
Okay.
right? But they try to tiptoe on that line, right? And they try to say it in a way to where they're really, requesting, but they want it to come across as a command or a demand.
And that's when you can say, excuse me, is this a request or a demand?
Exactly. If they
Right.
say stop, clearly it's a stop, right?
Yeah, right.
If they, ask you a question, I think that is also, clearly a request.
Right.
But if you want to be safe, you can just ask.
Right.
Right. Now, the law is, if this was to go before a court and the court was to say, oh, is this a request or is this a demand or a command? It's a reasonable person standard. You have to look at the totality of the circumstances. Everything going on. Like, for instance, if there's 12 police cars there versus like one police car there, what would that reasonable person believe that they can do? If all the cars like surround them, right? Then the language is in a different context versus a police officer walks up to you in street clothes.
Right. I'd be laying on the ground, flat out. I'm not moving.
But you have to take the totality of the circumstances.
Right.
You take everything that's going on, right? How many police officers there, everything else, everything that's going on. Even the location sometimes, right? And then you even take the tone of the officer into account.
Right.
Like how they say what they're saying. And what would a reasonable person believe? Would a reasonable person believe that they can refuse, right? Without some kind of a repercussion. Okay?
And the officers know this, right? This is part of their
They
training?
do. It's part of their training.
Okay.
And then additionally, the actual words. Now, this is actually the biggest thing. The actual words they use determine whether it's a request or a demand. Now, recently I got a $300,000 settlement in a case. The guy's case is IAMS, I-I-A-M-S. And it was in federal court. And this was a central issue in the case. And we got a $300,000 settlement because the police acted wrongly. And one of the big parts of the settlement was the police entered a settlement to where Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department entered a settlement to where they have to change their policies and training in writing. And they have to do training every year for 5 years to make sure that it sinks in. Right? And then that was followed up with a court order. So we have a court order and we have this settlement agreement that can be enforced, right? I actually brought the attachment that includes everything involved in it. Now, there's a lot involved in this, okay? For instance, can a traffic stop be prolonged? The answer is no.
Yeah, that interests me. But go ahead. Can you explain that? What that means?
So you get into situations to where a police officer will pull you over for traffic, but then want to do other stuff.
Right.
Right.
Do you mind if I search your vehicle?
Well, yeah, that type of thing,
Right.
And they can ask that question, and if you agree to it, that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But in a situation to where they're trying to extend their mission, right? And that's what the court cases say. They cannot prolong, even for 40 seconds. If you simply give them your license, registration, and insurance, and say, "I don't answer questions," can we please just get along with this? They're done. All they can do is they can reasonably go and take care of the traffic, and they have to let you go.
Right.
Now, in the meantime, if somebody else is going to bring a dog and search around the car, sniff for drugs or anything like that, if that's going to go on, they can do that, but they need more than one officer, right? And they're not allowed to extend the stop by running you through extra. Rather than just look for wants and warrants in a regular traffic stop like they would, they're not allowed to extend it to run you through extra things, right, that aren't part of a normal, ordinary traffic stop.
Okay.
And they're certainly not allowed to ask or even ask. This case says, ask your passengers for their identification so they can prolong the stop by checking their IDs.
So if I'm pulled over for going through a red light or making an illegal left turn or something like that, and I have 2 or 3 other people in the vehicle, the officer does not have the right to ask for their identification?
No, he doesn't.
Okay.
That was made very, very clear, and it's in Metro's training. So the training that we fought to have. Now the only time...
Wait. I got to stop you there. This particular training that we're going through right here, this portion, this is something that you caused to happen?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Good man.
Through a lawsuit that this year we settled that
The
lawsuit.
lawsuit that you were talking about earlier.
And they are required by court order to circulate this document to their officers every year for 5 years.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they read it.
Yeah, well, they've received training on it too.
Right.
So they're required to be trained, and they'll be held to this, right?
Right.
But they can't prolong these stops. Okay. The other part, actually, that we're here is: are passengers required to identify themselves during a traffic stop? No. And the very reason is that you don't have reasonable suspicion of the passenger if it's a traffic stop.
Right.
The driver is driving.
Yeah.
If they did something wrong, that's the driver, not everybody else.
And the passengers had no control over what was going on.
In Nevada's duty to identify statute, it is required to have reasonable suspicion to demand any kind of identification, or that someone identify themselves at all. And you don't have that unless you have, separate reasonable suspicion, right? Like if you got a needle in your arm or something, right, in the back of the car.
Yeah.
Right.
Or they smell alcohol, or see an open container.
Open container, that will
Right.
do it for the passenger,
Right.
right? So unless you have separate reasonable suspicion for the passenger, they have no right to demand their ID. And this court case has actually said, and their training says, that simply asking the passenger for their ID is prolonging the stop. So you can't do that either.
Wow.
That's in their training. That's in the case that we won in federal court. But here's the part that we're going to go back around to.
Yeah, please.
Okay? There's a small section on here where it's request versus command. In the Imes case, it became an issue of whether what the officers were saying were a request and a command. And so as part of the settlement, we wanted communication to be better. We actually, all sides did, okay? And so we agreed on this language. It says request versus command. There is a clear difference between a request and a demand. Requesting language should be in a tone that a reasonable person would interpret as a request and should end in a question mark, right? Examples: demand, identify yourself. Request, can I have your identification? And so that's what the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department is being taught. They are being taught, if you want it to be a request, make sure it has a question mark at the end. If you want it to be a demand, make sure it has a period or an exclamation point.
Yeah.
Either one. But that's important. So if you're asking, how do I know whether it's a request or a demand? Number one, just clarify, ask. Communicate well with the officer, be respectful. Excuse me, I need to know if that's a request or demand. If the officer doesn't want to tell you, just say, look, the Supreme Court has said in Colander that I have the right to ignore a request, right? So I need to know. I need you to tell me whether this is a request or demand. And whatever they say, you go along with.
Right.
You could challenge it later, right? If they, fruit of the poisonous tree, if they search and find something and it was not a proper stop or a proper search, you could throw out that evidence, right? You could even, if they step over the line, to the point where it causes civil liability, you can file a civil rights lawsuit. Of course, not if you're being a jackwagon, right? But all that can happen. But at that point, you need to respect that officer. Now, you have a right under the First Amendment to verbally challenge. I say verbally. You do not have a right to physically challenge an officer, right? You do not. If they put their hands on you,
right,
go with it, period, right? They may handcuff you. Go with it. You have the right to verbally challenge a police officer. And that's what you're exercising when you say, excuse me, officer, is that a request or a demand?
Right.
And it doesn't matter if they're impatient, right? and if they don't want you to ask that question. You have a First Amendment right to ask that question, right? And in fact, the Kelly Patterson case we talked about, the judge found that what the dialogue was protected by the First Amendment that happened between him and the officer, because he did everything right. And we'll talk about that case.
And it brings up the question in my mind is, are all of the Metro officers at this point in time wearing body cams?
They should be.
I know they should be. Are they, or?
Sometimes it's not running.
Okay.
Right? Look, always videotape when you can,
Yeah.
right? That protects everybody. I was actually saved by someone videotaping an encounter, right? I was in a situation, you could look up my arrest on YouTube, just Stephen Stubbs arrested on YouTube.
I know, it was cool.
Pull it up, right? I was in a situation where as I was standing with my client, when Gang Task Force showed up, he was a Christian minister, by the way, biker for Christ, right? When Gang Task Force showed up and ordered me to leave, and I refused. And I was 100% within my rights, and I did everything correctly. However, the sergeant decided that she was going to write up a report and submit it to the district attorney full of lies, full of things that just did not happen. That if they were true, I could have lost my law license. I could have been convicted of obstruction and lost my law license. And it was all baloney. However, one of them videotaped the encounter. And there weren't body cams at the time.
Right.
But somebody videotaped the encounter. And because they did, I was able to beat the charge, and it really saved my law license and save a good part of my livelihood, right?
Here in Nevada, are we allowed to do that? Are there situations where we cannot videotape an officer or officers while they're doing whatever it is that they're doing?
Okay, Fortis v. Seattle is the case. It's a Ninth Circuit case. It's good, the entire Ninth Circuit. Half of the circuit courts have established a case establishing that there is a constitutional freedom of press, First Amendment right to film officers. The Ninth Circuit is one of them.
Whether or not you're part of the press.
Right? It doesn't matter if you're part of the press. Right? It doesn't matter. Okay. So First Amendment right. In the Ninth Circuit, that's Fortis v. Seattle. And this is what's important. You have the right to videotape a law enforcement officer performing their official duties in public. Okay? Law enforcement officer, official duties in public. You have to have all three.
Okay, so in my house, is that still considered in public?
Well, that's fine because that's still, you still have that right in your house.
Okay. I just.
However, if you're in somebody else's house and they say, I don't want you to videotape.
That I understand.
Right? That's not public.
Right.
So that.
Or you're in a grocery store or something like that, and the manager from the store says, I don't want you filming that.
Yeah, you have to stop.
Yeah, okay.
That's private.
Yeah, got it.
That's
okay.
private. So,
did you get that? Everybody got that? Okay.
Okay. So other than that, it's a right. It's 100% a right, as long as you have those three things. Okay. So a law enforcement officer performing their, official duties in public. If they're with their kids off duty, you don't have that right.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's just not there. Okay. So just obey those three things.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for the clarification. So.
Now, again, going back to this, you have the First Amendment right to challenge police officers. And the main case here is Texas v. Hill. It's a United States Supreme Court case. To verbally challenge police officers. However, do not use fighting words. Now, there's a lot of cases that deal with fighting words, but basically, if a reasonable officer would take what you said as a threat, right? Those are fighting words, and those are not protected by the First Amendment, and that is not a proper challenge.
Right, you come any closer, I'm gonna kick your ass. That is not a good thing to say.
Yeah, but I mean, one guy, I just saw this on a video, one guy who was actually egging on the police, and he was, I guess that entrapment in reverse, whatever it is. He kept on telling these officers, I want to cook some bacon tonight, right? It's like, but the way he said it too, it's like, I would personally think that was a threat.
Right. Yeah, I would too.
And I think a court would as well.
Yeah.
Right. But he's trying to tiptoe on that line, right? And he's trying to provoke the officers, right? The officers actually, to their credit, they just ignored him. And if I was that officer, I wouldn't have ignored it. If you said something like that, right, to where not just calling them pigs or bacon or whatever, not just that. It's the fact that you would do something to that.
Right. Yeah. No. I get that. Yeah. I get the difference.
Right. I'm going to roast a pig tonight or something. If you said, I don't say things like that, right? But if you were to say something like that, if a reasonable officer would interpret that as a threat, that is not protected by the First Amendment.
And I think that that's something that the public needs to understand as well, is that we expect certain things from our law enforcement officers. And we should, in turn, act the same way that we think they should. That goes back to what you were talking about, the respect.
Just respect both ways.
This guy's doing his job. Now, maybe he's a jerk, but so is the guy who, gave me my coffee this morning, But he's still doing his job, and as long as I'm not going to be there stirring up shit, we should be fine, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, you have the constitutional right to be as much of an a-hole as you want to the officer.
Right.
You have that right.
I had heard that just because you say screw you or fuck you or something like that to an officer, that is not grounds for them to come and beat your ass.
No, it can't be, and it can't be grounds for anything else. Right? It's unpopular speech. It's the pivotal part of the First Amendment, right? If it's popular speech, it doesn't need to be protected, right? And there's a case, USA versus Pucha, P-O-O-C-H-A, in the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit actually has the most liberal of First Amendment protections. That was a case to where there was a bunch of hippies at a federal campground, and one of them had an arrest warrant. And so police came in to execute the warrant, and then they were surrounded by a whole colony of hippies. A whole colony. And they were saying the nastiest of nasty things. So much so that the California courts actually found them guilty of disturbing the peace for it. And it went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit said, oh no, it didn't go to the level of fighting words.
Yeah.
And because it didn't go to the level of fighting words, it is protected speech. Maybe reprehensible, maybe horrible, but it's protected.
Yeah.
Right? And the police cannot prosecute you or act on that. So don't get me wrong, the First Amendment protects that. However, going back to what we talked about at the very beginning, that means you'll beat the rap. That means the court should not prosecute you for that. However, no attorney is going to want to take that case, right? Because if your words would inflame a jury, then yes, you will win the case. Great. How much money are they going to give you?
Yeah.
Right. That's just the way it goes. Right. And in the federal court, which all civil rights cases get to the federal court, in a federal court, it has to be unanimous. Unanimous. Every one of those jurors has to agree. You get one juror that's offended and holds out, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so attorneys aren't going to take that risk. They're not going to take that risk with their time. They're not going to take that risk with the money they have to put up to prosecute the lawsuit.
Because you're fronting all those costs.
Yeah. Generally, the attorney fronts all the costs. Now, there's also a case McKinney in the Ninth Circuit, and that's a case to where somebody was writing chalk, and the officer told them to stop. Right? The officer actually had no right to. Right? That was later determined that he had First Amendment protected activity. Right? But he delayed. He finished writing. Right? And he delayed obeying the officer's commands.
Right.
Okay. However, he delayed it because he was doing a First Amendment activity, and then he verbally challenged the officer, right? And because of that verbal challenge, because he didn't act fast enough for the officer arrested him, and they actually defeated qualified immunity in that case. The court said no, right? That is not probable cause of obstruction. if you simply delay and you eventually obey a command, right? So you have the right, and you can still sue as long as you do things respectfully. You have the right to verbally challenge what's going on, and you can verbally challenge it, and that's protected under the First Amendment, and specifically in the Ninth Circuit, that's protected. And that's actually what happened with Kelly Patterson.
You keep mentioning Kelly Patterson. Is that something that we could talk about, that case?
Yeah, we can talk about the case.
He's a client of yours, is that correct?
He is, but nothing that I'm saying is confidential.
Okay.
It's all public record, and the case is in a municipal court before a judge.
Good,
so
because
there's no
I don't want to
jury.
get called in for a deposition or
You're
some
fine.
shit. No,
You're fine. They wouldn't have to. They just look at the video, right?
right.
You could put the video into evidence. Okay. So Kelly Patterson, he is a police accountability activist.
Okay.
Right. He's actually an activist for a lot of things. He feeds the homeless more than anybody I've ever known.
Wow.
Right. He's a part of this group called Food Not Bombs. Right, to where they are anti-war, and they are pro-police accountability. Right. He also writes for Cop Block in Nevada. That's a
Cop Block.
Cop Block.
Okay.
It's a website that the police hate, and they don't like him either. But what it does is it shows the worst part of police officers. They videotape or they get video of police officers not doing their job correctly. They write about it. They post the videos. They put it on display, and the police really don't like it. And so he's a target. And he's already won 2 federal lawsuits for being a target.
Right.
One of them, he just won his case at the Ninth Circuit on another chalking case. He was chalking, and he was arrested for chalking on a sidewalk. He defeated qualified immunity on that, and they'll either do the settlement or they'll go to trial on that one.
Sounds like I should invite him in
What?
to be a guest on the show.
Maybe you should.
Yeah.
Maybe you should. He's on a bunch of podcasts. He does that. So the other case, which actually I was the attorney for, he was just at Fremont Street, and he was videotaping an arrest, and it was actually a good arrest, right? It wasn't nothing was wrong with the arrest, but he was videotaping it, and one of the police officers got upset that he was videotaping and told him to move along. He said, "No, I have a right to be here." He was within a reasonable distance, 10 feet, just take 10 feet back, right? And if the police, tell you to go back a little more, as long as it's around the 10 feet, you're just do it, right?
That's why they make zoom lens.
Right. But he was far enough away, and the officer then challenged him, was just like, "What, are you stupid?" Right? And he's just like, "No, are you stupid?" And then the officer got mad. I got the video on my YouTube channel.
That was a request, not a demand, right?
What?
Are you stupid?
He was actually demanding he leave. He said, "Move along."
No, but I'm saying the question, what are you, stupid?
That's right. Right. A request for information.
Sorry.
Right, it's a question.
See, I pay attention here.
There you go. So what the officer did was he threw him in the street and then arrested him for being in the street. So we got him $120,000 for that.
Wow.
Right. So he's no stranger to this. He does this all the time. Well, this time he's riding his bike and he sees somebody that is pulled over by police for not having reflectors on his bicycle. Okay, so he stops. He's more than 20 feet away. He's probably 30 feet away. He's a long way away, and he just stops and he's just videotaping. That's all he's doing, is he's stopping and he's videotaping. He's not doing anything else. When an officer pulls up, and actually the film shows all requests, right? So. Could you please come to the front of the police car, right? But it's all these requests, and he verbally challenges the police officer. Why? What am I being detained for? It wasn't a legit detention. None of those things. They actually demanded that he identify himself, which they didn't have the right to do. We're certainly gonna take some legal action to make sure that Metro changes their training again on that, right? But what's important here is that he was respectful the entire time. I hope you'll actually play the video of it.
Right.
Right.
I'm sure we can get
Alex
that.
can post that. I can get it at the end so you can actually see. But everything the officer said, and they even testified in court, everything the officer said was a request. There was no demand whatsoever. And the officer testified, nope, that was a request. Yep, that was a request. We went through every single thing she said, and it was all requests with what was at issue there. And so actually the city attorney took the position that because she wanted it to be a demand and was just trying to be polite, like her intent that nobody can read her mind,
Right.
that he had to comply, and they charged him with obstruction for that, right? And Judge Kearns, to his credit, he's a very good judge. Judge Kearns dismissed the charge and said, no, that is not the test. Of course, there's the Colander case, and the judge was, I'm sure, relying on that. He didn't specifically say it, but I'm sure he said, no, it's circumstances what a reasonable person would say. The intent of the officer has nothing to do with anything.
And which brings up a question for me is that asking an officer, am I being detained? Or am I being arrested? Or if they say if you challenge them for as you say, and you're doing it in the right way, and the officer says, stay here, and walks away.
Okay.
And then would that be appropriate to say, officer, am I being detained?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a great question to ask.
Okay.
Am I being detained? A great question.
Right.
And if he says stay here, he
Yes.
answered your question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, that's a command.
Yes. And at that point, any court would see that as a command to stay there. And if you're not free to leave, you're being detained.
Right.
Right. But asking those questions, that is your right.
Okay.
Now, what's kind of interesting with the Kelly Patterson case is there's a 2015 law dealing with prosecutors when they take what's called a frivolous position. And the Ninth Circuit has defined a prosecutorial frivolous position as any time a prosecutor takes a position that is foreclosed by binding authority. That means a court who says something and they are bound by it. A lower court is bound by it. Perfect
Right.
example is United States Supreme Court case, right?
Right.
Everybody else is bound by that. Ninth Circuit, if you're in the Ninth Circuit, you're bound by that. If you're in the 10th Circuit, you're not. But in the Ninth Circuit, you are, right? Nevada Supreme Court, anything they say for all of Nevada, not in California, but in Nevada, that's binding, right? So if the position that the prosecutor takes is foreclosed by binding authority, you actually get attorney fees. And I filed an application for those attorney fees. I filed it. Actually today we got notice that the hearing was moved to August 31st. So August 31st, we're going to argue it. And I believe I set it all up because I set it all properly under the application statute. Right. Because the city took the position that that Mr. Patterson had to obey requests. And they specifically took the position that because the officer intended it to be a demand, that he had to obey it. And Judge Kearns didn't buy that at all. Yeah. And Colander is very clear. For decades, Colander is very clear. You have the right to refuse and ignore a request without fear of prosecution.
Okay, so you have stated in a couple of instances here about these cases and that this was decided decades ago and this has been the standard and blah, blah, blah. So this may not be appropriate to bring it up, and if not, you'll tell me, I'm sure, or please do. With the recent Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade, what is to keep them from doing similar things to stuff like this? Okay,
that's they're not really equatable.
And that's why.
I'll just say all the Roe v. Wade basically said is there's no federal protection, but each state decides.
Okay,
right?
all right.
And so with that statute, if a prosecutor takes a position that is foreclosed by binding authority, right? If prosecutor takes that position, then you can get attorney fees.
Okay.
Right? That's the general law. You have to look at the facts and circumstances and see if you meet the application. There's a whole statute, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4. You got to
Right.
meet everything, right? And so you'd have to look at that. But I think that's way too far out of what we're doing here.
Okay, good. No,
Really
and it brought that up because if they could do this, they could do that.
Yeah.
So anyway, is there anything else that we need to cover here, because we're getting a little bit short on time? So.
Yeah, don't be a jackwagon. That goes for police and the people dealing with police. Just be respectful, right? That's so much better if everybody's just respectful and you clearly communicate. And if there's a legal fight, then we can do that legal fight.
Right.
But you don't need to muck everything up, right, by acting like a jackwagon.
And one other quick thing before we get out of here is you had said something about, and I think it was involving a traffic stop, that here's my license and registration and insurance, and I'm not going to answer any questions.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and so that is, you are within your rights, just saying, here you go, do what you got to do.
If you give the officer your license, registration, and insurance,
Right.
and say, I don't answer questions, and anytime they ask a question, just say, I don't answer any questions, right? That is the very best way to do it. Just respectfully, officer, I don't answer any questions.
Right. Okay, great.
Best way to handle it.
Cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate this. This has
pleasure.
been absolutely enlightening for me.
My pleasure.
And hopefully for you folks out there too. And there's no doubt in my mind we're going to have this guy back here.
Okay.
And if you have any questions or anything, you can contact us here at WWDBTV, or you can contact our Nevada judges. And you'll probably get a better response from them because they know what they're talking about. And
Thank you, John.
Stephen, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
And thank you all for watching, and stay safe out there.
You're asking if there's a difference, sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. What is that difference?
Request is request somebody for it could be requesting is for information. Demanding is telling somebody to do something.